So I mean, you talked about people in these classrooms having questions about whether it's safe to eat kelp. What kind of is the answer to that question? New, I know that it's nuanced and it's not just a concrete, simple thing, but like, what's that conversation like?
Well, the thing that was surprising in the study is we found that there were levels of some chemicals that exceeded what the EPA's health screening levels are. And we looked very specifically at a group. We looked at a group of 6 focal chemicals out of this 160 plus chemicals we looked at, but we looked at PCBs and something called benzoapyrene, which is, and this is going to sound like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, but it is a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon. It comes from oftentimes uncombusted fuel. So when you're driving your car around and it's belching out stuff from the tailpipe, that has PAHs in it. And one of those PAHs is benzoapyrene. And forest fires also can release benzoapyrene. So it's got natural and unnatural, natural and human-based sources.
Right.
So we looked at benzoapyrene, also some metals. One was cadmium, another mercury. We looked at lead, and we looked at arsenic. And so based on those 6, we found that PCBs could be problematic at some sites. They could pose a risk to human health when you look at the amount that's consumed of seaweed. That's what's called a dose of seaweed. Like you sit down at a table and how much seaweed you eat, that is like a serving or a dose.
Right.
And that is only 5 grams dry weight. That's like equivalent to about a sheet or 2 of nori, depending how the nori is made. Nori
Okay.
is what's wrapped around sushi kind of rolls. So when you look at it wet, it's about almost a cup of loosely packed seaweed. When it's dried, it's like a 1/4 cup because seaweed really gets small. It's just mostly moisture. Anyways, the point of it is that most people don't consume seaweed every day. If you did consume 5 grams of seaweed a day from some of these sites, you would be above a particular screening level for the EPA
Yeah.
for, it's called the cancer slope factor. But in general, most of the sites were not problematic.
This is a line from not necessarily the study, but from some of the communications that came out from the study. But fortunately, most contaminants occurred at levels too low to be of concern for human health. But so if you had what you're describing, if you had this certain kind every day at this certain site, you would be above levels technically. But that the takeaway from that should not be that seaweed broadly is unsafe to eat.
That's correct. Most people eat seaweed as a condiment or as one ingredient in, say, a soup or a stir fry. Most people don't sit down and eat a seaweed salad every single day. But
Yeah.
the point of it all is that seaweeds are really mineral dense and nutrient dense. You don't need to eat a lot to get the benefits of them in terms of their nutritive benefits. They have a lot of fiber too. And so they really are best used as kind of one ingredient in something. We also found in the study, seaweed contaminants change over the season. So you could have one level of cadmium or arsenic, and it could change from June to September in the seaweed harvesting season. And in that knowledge, that's not new. That's something people have said in the literature for a long time, that seaweed varies in its kind of contaminant level and its nutrients over seasons with salinity changes, depending if there are other seaweeds competing for the minerals in the area, then the seaweeds have a limited capacity to sometimes build in the minerals. Although some seaweeds, like brown seaweeds, can just pack things in over and over again, where green and reds can't do that. But
Yeah.
it's very complex. So the answer, I would say, is that in general, what you said is so correct, that we have found that for many sites, it's not a concern at all. And when you eat seaweeds in a small amount and you're not eating them every day, it's generally not problematic.
Like, we're talking specifically about seaweeds right now. Can't you take a couple steps back out of this study and probably say that same statement about a lot of foods, a lot of things? Eat them in high quantities every day, and that might pose a problem. Eat them in moderation. I don't want to like project that onto the study results, but it wouldn't be good for me to eat a cut of red meat every single day of my life. I know that.
Well, and I think that, Justin, that's a really interesting and important thing to reemphasize. I spoke with a wonderful toxicologist, Dr. Peter Ross, and at that time he was with the Vancouver Aquarium. Now I think he's teaching at one of the universities in Vancouver.
Quick thing, Peter Ross is an alum of this podcast. We interviewed him. He was great.
He's wonderful. He told me early on, Jennifer, whatever you do, don't scare tribes and First Nations away from their traditional foods by telling them all about the contaminants, and not also that the other part of this message that's important to get to the public is that all foods have contaminants in them. And Salish seafoods like salmon and Dungeness crab also have PCBs. And so, well, we found them in seaweed, they're in all these other foods as well. Now, they're also in grocery store foods. And we looked at commonly consumed foods from the grocery store through a study that's called the Market Basket study. And it's something that the USDA puts out. And basically, they take a grocery cart and they run it through a big store and they put in all these products. They go back to the lab and they run them through all these different tests, and they tell you how much lead or how much cadmium or PCBs are in certain foods. And what they found out, and this is what Peter Ross said, is all foods are polluted. And we looked at an equal, like a portion of, say, a well-done steak and a portion of seaweed. And the portion of well-done steak got way more PAHs than seaweed.
I just think that's massively important context for, it's not just I mean, you have to place it in the wider context of what's in all foods to understand what it means to talk about certain levels of things in seaweed specifically. It's just, you just need it. Because if you just say certain levels, blah, 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 I think it's easy for a person on the receiving end of that message to just be like, that's got some chemicals in it sometimes to certain degrees. I'm all set on that. I think that can scare a person off if it doesn't get placed in its context, you know?
Absolutely. And I think we as seaweed eaters and we as just food consumers in general, we haven't gotten the whole story about all these other foods. And that's what surprised me, is that, you could look at things like kale and Brussels sprouts, and they could have higher levels of PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, than seaweed, in part because these things hang out in a field a long time with their lovely, round Brussels sprout bodies, or the leafy, folding kind of tall, large leaves of the kale. And PAHs are in the air. They're tiny little particles that land on these plants, and they just end up, making a little bit of PAH kind of like residue on the outside. And so it's good to rinse your vegetables, because they have PAHs on. So kale had more PAHs, a serving of kale done by the Market Basket study, than the seaweeds we found. And yet, how many people, they don't blink twice. They just think, kale's so healthy, I'm going to eat a lot of it.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of risks, benefits, amounts, going easy and balancing all these things, eating a breadth of diet. Seaweeds have got phytochemicals in them that are anti-cancer, they've been associated with lowering the risk for Alzheimer's, cancer, obesity, heart disease. So they have things that some other land vegetables do not present.
Yeah.
So seaweed has a lot of gifts in it, as well as, you open the whole package, just don't eat it every day.
Yeah,
necessarily
yeah.
from polluted sites.